It looks like we've still got people joining, but I'm conscious of our time constraints, the number of speakers that we have, and the topics and diverse subject matter that they're going to talk about, which coalesce around the subject of small unmanned aerial systems, which is a growing area of interest nationally and certainly in the legal profession. My name is Mike McDaniel. I am the Director of Homeland Security Law Programs here at WMU Cooley Law School, retired Brigadier General, and was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon for a period of time. I'm very pleased with our panel today, and I will allow our moderator to introduce the panel. But first, I just want to say a couple words about the program. If you are a Cooley student and you are on here and you are interested in your LLM program, please just send me an email directly, mcdanielm@cooley.edu. And I say that to any lawyers who are interested in the LLM as well. If you are a student and you are interested in our law review, the Homeland and National Security Law Review, which is sponsoring this and has put this great program together today, please get a hold of Katie Komorowski, and she'll tell you how you can join the law review or apply to join the law review. It's also under the student organizations. So I want to thank two individuals. First, Professor Colin Mcguire has our as a fairly new adjunct, but with us, but he's just taken off with some really great new areas of law, including dealing with drones in a very popular course. And I also want to mention Major Sam Sliney, our faculty advisor for the Homeland and National Security Law Review. Both are just great assets to the Homeland Security law community as well as to WMU Cooley, and I thank them for their efforts scholastically and towards our students. So without further ado, then I want to turn it to the editor-in-chief of the Homeland and National Security Law Review here at WMU Cooley, Katie Komorowski, who has shown just great desire and passion for this area of law. And I'm very pleased to have her moderating our event here today. Katie?
Thank you for the introduction, General McDaniel, and good afternoon and welcome everyone to WMU Cooley Law School's first drone symposium. I would like to thank the law school and General McDaniel for being very supportive of my legal education and career aspirations, and for allowing me to organize this event today as editor-in-chief of the Homeland and National Security Law Review, and also as the founder and president of the Homeland and National Security Emergency Response and Education Association here at the law school. I would like to thank our panelists, Mr. Watson, Ms. Radigan, Mr. Conklin, and Professor Mcguire for their contributions today and for their time. As General McDaniel mentioned, I am a JD LLM student here at the law school, and I will be graduating next month with my JD and anticipate graduating the following December with my LLM. I've worked 3 years in the aerospace industry, and I'm currently an extern with Rodenhouse Law Group, and I'm very excited to be here to moderate this event with you today. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Gary Watson. He'll be talking about drone threats and countermeasures. Mr. Watson is the Vice President of Solutions at Fordham Technologies, a leading manufacturer of radars and counter-drone systems. Gary's team is responsible for architecting innovative security solutions for Fordham's customers and leads Fordham's popular counter-drone webinar series. Prior to Fordham, Gary spent over 30 years as a computer hardware and software engineer in the secure data storage industry, including 20 years as a CTO of Nexan Technologies, a company he co-founded. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Gary Watson.
Thank you, Katie. Very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. I'm not a lawyer, but I've come across a lot of legal topics, and I'll briefly summarize what we've come across in the drone and counter-drone world. And what we basically do is we make equipment that detects drones and tracks drones and, if necessary, captures drones and tows them away if they're doing something bad. So you're seeing on the screen our fully autonomous drone hunting drone. And I'm not going to talk about it in any detail today, but it's quite a product, and for the most part, none of you are allowed to buy it. And I'll talk to you about why. So let's talk about what you're allowed to do with drones. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Part 107 requirements and privileges. I will say that drone law seems to me to be the most misunderstood and area of law where people have completely wrong ideas about what they are and are not allowed to do. And I'll give you a couple concrete examples in a second. So Part 107 applies specifically to the commercial use of drones. There's other parts of the FAA regulations. There's a more restrictive version for hobbyists, for example. But just this is illustrative of the requirements. So the pilot has to have a license. It's basically a knowledge test. You take it at the same place that you get a regular pilot's license. It's a test about how to understand the airspace and weather and safe operations and so on. It does require that you get permission to fly your drone in controlled or restricted airspace. And there's a lot of controlled and restricted airspace. If you're not a pilot, you may not be familiar with this. For example, the entire city of Las Vegas is restricted. You can't fly a drone in Las Vegas without permission. So that's an example of where you may surprisingly violate the rules. You have to watch your drone with the unaided human eye, no binoculars, and using first-person video does not qualify. In other words, you can't fly beyond visual line of sight. You can't fly over people or crowds or cars. And all of these you can get waivers for, but this is the general set of rules. You have to fly below 400 feet above ground level, and a lot of drones can fly 10,000 feet high, so it's very easy to bust that rule. You have to be less than 55 pounds under this particular regulation, less than 100 miles an hour. A lot of drones are faster than that. If you're going to fly at night, you need a particular set of licensing endorsements. You need special equipment on your drone. There must be 3 miles of visibility. You're not allowed to do anything careless or reckless. You can't drop things unless it's safe to do so. You can't carry hazardous materials. And someone got in trouble for that. They strapped a gun to a drone and thought that'd be fun to make a YouTube video. Well, guess what? The FAA didn't think that was funny. And then you're supposed to do a pre-flight inspection of the drone. There's a lot of other little rules, but that's the basic summary of what 14 CFR Part 107 says. And it's important to note that state and local law enforcement, as I understand it, cannot usually enforce Part 107 themselves. This is what FAA gets to enforce. However, state and local can and do enforce various rules and regulations associated with possession of a drone, taking off and landing a drone, or things like that. For example, in a particular national park in this area, or not national park, it's a park in this area, there's a local law that says you can't fly drones there. They have no authority to stop you from flying them through the airspace, but if you take off or land from their park, they can and will cite you for that and seize your drone. So that's a quick summary of Part 107. Now, getting into the misunderstanding part of it, there's a local sort of blogging service called Nextdoor. Basically, this is where the people in your exact area sign up for this Facebook sort of thing, but it's only for people in your neighborhood and surrounding neighborhoods, called Nextdoor. So somebody says, hey, a few days ago, we had a loud, large drone drop into our backyard, and obviously they were distressed by this fact. Has anyone had this happen? And I was fascinated by how many enthusiastic responses this got. Normally, a Nextdoor post gets 1 or 2 responses, if that. At the time I captured this, it was 45 comments, and they're mostly along the lines of these. Hey, shoot that thing down. You know, it's time for target practice. Keep a gun close by. That's what a shotgun's for, etc., etc. And this seems to be, people feel that if a drone's flying around your house in some way that bothers you, just whip out the old 12 gauge and blast it out of the sky. Well, you know what? It turns out that isn't legal. 18 U.S.C. Section 32, which is the probably the most important law in this area, basically says that if you disable, damage, or wreck any aircraft, you can be imprisoned for up to 20 years for doing that. And guess what? The feds consider a drone an aircraft, and they've made that abundantly clear. Even threatening to do any of this stuff is up to 5 years. And there's also the Aircraft Piracy Act, which has other provisions about disrupting or delaying or whatever an aircraft. That's 49 USC 46502. And this is not the only 2 laws that impact this, but there's certainly 2 of the most toothy ones. So are police departments or private individuals allowed to act against drones if you think they're doing something they shouldn't do? So federal law considers a drone, even one you bought for $10 at the toy store, to be an aircraft. And that means from the blade of grass up. So a lot of people have these misconceptions about if it's under so many feet or whatever, you can do something about it. That's not consistent with the FAA's interpretation of what their airspace authority is. So it is illegal, absent strong justification or a carve-out, to damage, destroy, disrupt, or delay an aircraft in flight. And that includes drones. Now, DoD, DOE, DOJ, and DHS have some limited carve-outs. I've captured the specifics here, and you can have a copy of these slides if you wish. So they can do various drone things that they feel they need to do, and that's mostly who we sell our products to, is the feds. Although we do sell some of our detection products to state and local police, but the actual drone capturing type products are typically just the feds. But there is a school of thought that if a drone is literally a hazard to life at that exact moment, it's law of self-defense. You can take action if you can obviously prove in court you're doing what you're supposed to do. So a lot of counter-drone solutions involve jamming the radio control circuitry, and that ensnares a bunch of different regulations. So first of all, most radio controls for drones are in fact licensed. So and a jammer is typically not licensed. It's very, very difficult to get permission to possess or operate a jammer in the United States, unless you're one of the 4 federal agencies that has the carve-out for this. And you ensnare a bunch of very serious rules. And both the FAA and the FCC are very enthusiastic about fining people 5- and 6-figure fines or more if you violate these things. I saw a 7-figure fine on one of these things recently. So and so any interference with these radio controls are risky. And for one reason, they typically use the frequencies that Wi-Fi uses. So if you're going to disrupt Wi-Fi, you're going to make some enemies. Future drones are going to be using the 5G network, and again, disrupting that would make you pretty unpopular. So that's a set of laws you need to worry about. And then for very serious drone threats, because not every drone uses radio control. Some of them are waypoint driven, and they just have GPS waypoints that they've been programmed to use. There are multiple laws associated with interfering with the GPS system. Basically, you're interfering with government satellite communications. It is criminal stuff. You're not allowed to do it. And it's also very hazardous. A lot of life safety stuff depends upon GPS working. Teslas, for example, aircraft use GPS. The equipment moving around on an airport is often GPS monitored. So anything you do to fiddle with the GPS system, spoofing it or jamming it, is again going to make you very unpopular and at great personal risk to yourself and liability for whatever damage you cause. Furthermore, just spying on drones using passive radio frequency detection systems that detect and intercept the communications and decode them can ensnare the eavesdropping and hacking laws, 18 U.S.C. 2511, 18 U.S.C. 1030, computer fraud and abuse. These are, if there's a communication that's encrypted and protected against you looking at it, and you look at it anyway in the United States, that's generally not legal. And furthermore, if you're law enforcement, you may possibly need a search warrant to do any of this, even if it is legal. So it's worth bearing in mind that systems, just because they're passive, aren't necessarily automatically legal to use. And I would say this is the fuzziest area of law right now, because I know there's a number of these on the market, and nobody's been locked up that I know of, but still, it's an area that needs some thinking. There is one interesting one. We're not really sure of the legal standing of it. Is DJI, the drone company, makes something called Aeroscope. Aeroscope intercepts communications from their drones, if you buy a drone from them, and puts it up on the screen so you can see everything about the drone. But we believe that when you buy a drone from them, you're signing an agreement that they're allowed to intercept your communications if they feel the need to. So maybe it doesn't apply to that specific example. I will say that all this stuff I've talked about is neatly summarized in a federal legal memo from 2020. It's an advisory on the application of federal laws to the use of and acquisition of these kinds of systems. And for this kind of thing, it's a very approachable document, maybe 10 pages long, and it's definitely worth a read if you're in this space. And I would say that even if you don't have the federal authority to deal with a drone because you're not a Fed, let's say you're state, local, or a private citizen, there are things you could, if a drone's doing something illegal, there are things you could consider. So if you can find the operator on the ground, you can think about whether they're violating various aspects of Part 107. Is it a careless operation? If it's flying around your backyard, it's almost by definition not within their personal vision. So therefore, they're breaking Part 107. And you gather information and evidence of this and let the FAA know about it and see if they'll do something about it, and especially if it's doing something illegal. If it's busting airspace, if you're happen to be in an area that's restricted, either a TFR because it's a Super Bowl or Class Bravo or Charlie airspace, and they haven't got permission, FAA would probably step in and have a chat with them about that. There's also state and local laws about voyeurism, or if they're spying on children, possibly manufacturing child pornography. Here in Georgia, where I live, there's actually a law against deliberately photographing children without the parents' permission. So there's all kinds of things like this, but that doesn't mean you get to shoot the drone down. You have to find the guy on the ground who's operating it and go have a chat with them. And as I mentioned, the local ordinances may exist about launching and landing drones. The batteries only last 20 minutes, so they're not going to be up there forever. Just find out where they're going. And if you are state and local and you want the feds to come help you, there is a specific policy and protocol for how to do this. It's the Attorney General's guidance document. We discussed it at length on our May 2020 webinar. The document's dated April 13th. It goes into great detail about what you should be doing if you want your governor to request assistance for some specific issue, bearing in mind it probably needs to be a very serious issue before you get their attention. And so that's my quick talk, and I'm happy to take questions, or I'll stick around for the rest of the panel. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this very august body. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Watson, for your insight on this emerging threat. If you would please stay on, we're going to take questions at the end. Next, we have Ms. Catherine Radigan as a panelist talking about data privacy and drones. Ms. Radigan is counsel at Robinson & Cole in Providence, Rhode Island, and is admitted to the State Bar of both Rhode Island and Massachusetts, as well as the federal district courts in both states and the U.S. Supreme Court. She earned her JD from Roger Williams University School of Law. She's a member of Robinson & Cole's Business Litigation Group and Data Privacy and Cybersecurity team. She advises her clients on data privacy and security, cybersecurity, and compliance with related state and federal laws. She counsels clients facing government investigations over alleged noncompliance and advises clients on development of privacy and security plans, how to best handle high-risk data, and to avoid breaches of cyber intrusions. Catherine is a member of the firm's drone compliance team, where she advises clients on all legal issues surrounding the use of commercial drones, including navigation of the Federal Aviation Administration regulations, commercial registration requirements, and Part 107 waivers. She reviews and prepares employee and subcontractor agreements for the piloting and use of drones, and advises commercial businesses on insurance options for adequate coverage for drone use. Catherine handles drone-related litigation, such as claims involving manufacturing defects, personal injury, or property damage. She has given numerous presentations about implementing UAS into company infrastructure and privacy and cybersecurity issues related to drone use. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Radigan.
Thank you. That makes it sound like, gee, I'm very busy, I guess. So it couldn't be more, it's just a perfect segue from what we just heard into what I want to talk about. It's kind of funny because a lot of the examples about, if people are doing these things, maybe they're breaking the law, or here are the federal regulations that may apply. I want to talk about a little bit, and I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to kind of talk in this short, I know we have shorter time period than we could talk about what I want to discuss in privacy and cybersecurity for an entire day. So, yeah, Colin's, nodding his head. But I want to talk about sort of this next frontier in data privacy and cybersecurity, and that's in drone law, because how drones sort of became part of my practice, which is really 100% data privacy and cybersecurity, was, I want to say, I keep saying 5 or 6 years ago, but then the years go by, so maybe before that. Drones we can start to consider them just like mobile. When phones kind of came out, there was a camera on a phone, and everybody was freaking out. And oh my gosh, I don't want people carrying a device around that has a camera and they can take my picture. And now we can't live without our cell phones. Drones are just another tool that businesses are using, industries are using, government, sort of across every industry, all sorts of different uses, all, whether public, private, there's hobbyists, everyone can use them for all different purposes. So it's just like kind of pulling that tool out of your back pocket, same as we use our, an iPad maybe on a construction site, or a cell phone. Drones are now really just another tool that's collecting data. So really, with all the technological advancement, now we kind of think about, well, what are the foundations of the law in privacy and security, and do they really apply to drones? Does it fit this technology? And we've just heard it really doesn't, because we don't have any specific laws that say, here's, this applies to drones, or this applies to the technology that you are using as the payload on your drone. It's just kind of fitting them into the laws we already have. The voyeurism, you can't eavesdrop, you can't collect, you're not recording conversations or video. It's sort of, where can we kind of push them in? And I sort of will, and maybe in my presentation, you'll see, I kind of think we need really specific, some guidelines on this, because I think that the industry as a whole, the public, that example, the name, I didn't even know of that cool site that you can say, here was a drone on, and it was bothering me, and then everybody can kind of put their comments. The public is never going to sort of accept Amazon dropping your package on your front step, or a pizza being delivered, if they're concerned about privacy. So, I think that part of that is to really put together some kind of guidelines and system that the industry can follow, so that the public kind of goes the same way we do with cell phones. Okay, you can use them, and I don't care anymore that there's a drone. What that is, I don't have the answer for that, but I want to talk a little bit about why we need it. So in the privacy space, we heard about Part 107, what it regulates. It doesn't regulate anything to do with information gathering or privacy. The FAA has actually, I always quote them on this, because they say they kind of stay away from this, and they want someone else to come up with regulations or guidelines. And they say, we strongly encourage all UAS pilots to check local and state laws before gathering information through remote sensing technology or photography. And then they can go, okay, so figure that out. Because realistically, what the FAA cares about, what the industry cares about, is safety. That's the number one concern in aviation. And I would argue that part of that safety is the privacy, is the cybersecurity, making sure we're, when we collect data, or when we're transmitting data, or when we're flying, nobody's kind of, all of these different examples we just heard about, where you can spoof, or you can hack in and you're given a new GPS coordinate. That is part of safety to me, and that kind of falls on the privacy and security piece. So there was something that came out in May of 2016. This is right before Part 107 was effective in August of 2016. But they came out with these sort of best practices, and I'll only talk about 5 of them. I think there were maybe 6 or 7, but some specifically relate to the media, and this is more generally to sort of any industry. But when I read them, I remember thinking, well, this is just basic. I do privacy and security every day. If your company starts using a drone, you should be doing these things anyway. But there were some guidelines with industry stakeholders. They said, okay, what are the things that we should do? And it's inform people that you're using a drone. A good example, we have insurance company clients who I think they were some of the first, outside of obviously media and the package delivery, but they said, wait, we don't have to send a adjuster up onto a roof to look at damage. We can just have that person learn how to use a drone and send it up and get better footage. And so the concept is, if someone's going to be using a drone for that purpose, which is a legitimate business purpose, and they're flying it under Part 107, you see a neighbor outside of the house say, hi, I'm so-and-so from this insurance provider. I will be using a drone and I'm not going to capture any images of you. You know, that's kind of just a general inform people what you're doing. I think of it the same way as website privacy policies. No one reads those, that's different, but at least it's there. It's informing what you're doing with the data. Another, you know, showing care when you're collecting that information. So retain only what you have to retain when you're using a drone. So you're collecting data and you're collecting images, and you realize after, when you're looking at what you've collected, that you have some people in the background. Blur it out if you can. You know, like, just don't kind of keep any information that you don't have to. It should be part of what we're thinking when we're building drone programs into what our businesses are doing. Limiting the use of the data. I mean, it's the same concept internally. I have discussions. We deal with a lot of whether it's an employee inadvertently sends information or some of these ransomware attacks. You know, you're looking at, why do you have the data? Did you need to keep it? You know, what, limit the use. Don't share it. If can it be de-identified? You know, securing that data. These are some basic things that we do with all data, but we don't. At least I don't think we're kind of there yet in the drone space, where just think of it as another way of collecting data. It's just a tool to collect data. Once you get past, here's how we operate it. You know, now the concern with much of the public, and anytime I bring up drones, it's always, oh, they're creepy, I don't know who's recording me, is when we start to bring in the privacy and security piece and put in some guidelines. And I will say it's very difficult in this space to monitor. There are so many different state laws, local laws, ordinances, and I think that's part of it. We have such a patchwork. I find it similar to the way data breach laws are in the US. There's 50 different state laws, and then you have industry-specific laws. And so a way that, since we're still at the beginning of regulating the space in drones, I think if we come up with one, one set standard, it could really help, be able to let the technology that we have, that we can already use, start, being utilized across the board by different industries. I'll say, I always tell people, it isn't really that, people go, oh, when do you think we'll start seeing drones, flying around our neighborhoods, delivering packages? And I say, well, it's not that they can't. It's like, they can do that. They can physically carry it. They have the technology to do that. It's that the regulations don't allow. And why haven't they? I think there's a lot of barriers. We've seen, we've seen some amendments to the regulations where flights over people with certain safety measures are okay, flights at night. We're kind of getting there, but to truly get there, I think that the privacy piece, at least from the public perspective, really has to be addressed. So the other piece I want to talk about in privacy, before I get to some of the cyber issues, how it relates, this was also addressed. That's why I love it. It kind of all goes together. But the idea of trespass and then aerial trespass in the law. So you think of it as, with trespass, okay, so, like some kids after school cut through their neighbor's lawn, they're trespassing over. That's kind of an easy concept when you think of our restatement and the tort law basics, right? But then you talk about drones and people are shooting them down. So there are laws that relate to the actually shooting an aircraft down. But what about the concept of, okay, they're trespassing or they're invading my privacy? I think part of it, you can kind of apply the aerial trespass laws that we've or case law that we've established. But it's difficult because without, a regulation specific to a drone flying over your property, people are going to take their own, there's going to be their own action, whatever they think is the right thing to do. I know this was probably several years ago, but, especially as in the legal arena, but the drone slayer case, everybody loves that case because, it was a little bit, people got crazy. They started making t-shirts to support drone slayer, or, if we don't really if we don't address this privacy concern, or like, you're coming in my space with this aircraft, you're just going to keep seeing crazy stories like that. There's actually, I can give this to Katie after. There's a great site that kind of just continually keeps up with litigation in this space. And you read about what people are doing with drones. I mean, it's crazy. It's honestly crazy. And that's part of why we need to build trust in the public. And that relates to privacy, what we're doing with the data, knowing who's flying above your property. I think this maybe could be addressed. It's hard. I know I don't have very good eyesight, but there's the registration. I think of it like a car. I can't look up a license plate myself, but if there's a car sitting outside of my house for a few days, I could call and say, hey, there's this really weird car and it's been sitting there, and I can give the license plate. You know, would that alleviate some of the public concern if I could say, this is the drone that was flying over my property, here's a number on it, or, you know, Amazon has to identify that it's an Amazon drone, whatever it is that we kind of do to build that trust, that will, I think, help kind of moving forward and put more drones in the airspace, which I'm for, because I think they're a great tool. So I'll just segue into sort of the other piece of my practice and how it relates to drones, but there's the privacy concern, and I think it relates to the emerging security issue, which is that they're being used for cyber attacks, or, you know, as vectors themselves, or the data that we're collecting on them isn't really protected because no one's thinking of it as a means to collect data. So I have a good example here. I thought this was kind of interesting, but, you know, so here's my scenario. A real estate agent hires a drone pilot to collect images for their website, and they want to get some really cool different images of the properties they sell. So they're taking some using all different technology. One of them is they're using a thermal imagery device, so they can get like these cool different colored images. And unbeknownst to a couple in a backyard, they were under a sun tent, but they were in there, and there's some video captured, sharing an intimate moment, and nobody kind of realizes it because they're not looking at it. And now it's posted to the real estate agent's website, and then it's on their social media, and somebody, because this is what happens now when stuff goes on the internet, notices, oh, look at that, look, they have this video, you can see this couple. And now basically, you know, they're embarrassed, they have this unwanted publicity, but what's regulated there? I mean, yeah, privacy, right, is we can go and file a lawsuit for, you know, a tort, but what actually protects that data? I mean, in the space that I'm in, privacy, not much specifically. So how do you kind of protect this data that's being sent by drones? I don't have an answer for that because it doesn't fall under any of the privacy laws that are currently out there. We think of personal information more. You know, if these drones were collecting our social security number, then we'd have a way to say, okay, you violated this law and that law. You know, the thriving community of drone hackers, just to be able to get the imagery and the photographs, whatever data, 3D mapping that we're collecting through drones, through these, honestly, they're pretty. Most drones, unless you're thinking about it, they're going to have links that are pretty vulnerable to compromise. People aren't thinking about encryption when they're transmitting that data. So now you move away from the real estate agent. Now I go, I'm actually taking imagery of critical infrastructure. And I don't want bad actors to have access to maybe gas line mapping that I'm doing. But I'm transmitting it back and forth with, you know, I'm not thinking about it. I'm just going, okay, well, here's your images and I'm doing the service, but we're not protecting that data. And it really allows hackers to get access to that information. And again, it kind of falls out of that privacy, security, the personal information piece that we think about all the time. But there's a lot of sensitive data that can be collected through drones. So as I move from saying we definitely need some privacy guidelines, I think we also need some security guidelines in this space, because, you know, everything that was discussed in the first presentation, the spoofing, the GPS spoofing, you know, the man in the middle of attacks, the use of Wi-Fi, all of that, it's all ways that hackers are getting in to get the data. It's not only a way that you can stop a drone from, you know, if it's flying into an airspace that you don't want it to, but it's also a way that hackers are going to get access to the data that's on the drone, or take the drone over and use the drone as a vector of attack. I know that I couldn't remember, I was trying to find it before the symposium started. There was a few years ago, I mean, drones were being used outside of the US, but there were political rallies and drones would have, you know, an explosive device put right on it and fly into a crowd. You know, they're being used as a weapon themselves. And so there's all of these reasons that we really need to think about, maybe all the way down to the manufacturing level. You know, what can we put in place that really helps secure the data, helps secure the device itself. And then we kind of can think a big picture wise, what are we doing with the data? What are the privacy regulations that we can put in place? What can the industry agree to? And then I think you'll kind of find that the public will be more okay with the pizza deliveries and package deliveries, and and then the really good uses like delivering medication, delivering supplies to a disaster area. All these good things that drones can be used for. I think one of the really important pieces is to think from a fundamental, when we're starting to create new, you mentioned the 5G, but when we're creating these new designs, new software, the privacy and security of the data collection and transmission is really, really important. So, that's kind of that's my plug for for anybody that's out there that wants to help actually write regulations or guidelines in this space. Safety is obviously number one in aviation, but I think part of that is including privacy and security as fundamental design principles. So hopefully I probably just scared everyone of all the things that drones can do that, you think about, but happy to take questions afterwards too.
Thank you, Ms. Radigan, for your insight on the data privacy issues surrounding drones. Again, we will go ahead and take questions at the end of the symposium. Next, we have Mr. Rick Conklin as a panelist talking about drone pilot legal concerns. Mr. Conklin is a January 2021 WMU Cooley Law School graduate and an associate attorney with Reeder, Pletcham, and Murphy in Grand Rapids. He is also a Federal Aviation Administration Part 107 licensed commercial drone pilot and owns and operates Drone 616 LLC. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Conklin.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you to Gary and Catherine, both very spot on and really just touching on what everyday pilots and people who work with UAS or in the UAS industry, what they deal with. So the way that I came into the drone world was I saw drones were becoming very popular. And in my undergrad, I decided I was going to start my own drone company. And once I got into law school, I decided to marry the two hobbies into understanding the complex area of not only drone law, but liability as it pertains to the pilot. Now, before we go into the liability portion, I want to set us up with kind of a scenario. Imagine you receive a drone as a gift. This drone has 4 propellers, it's a plastic frame, just like what you'd buy at Walmart or what you'd see at Walmart. Never having flown a drone before, you eagerly take it outside, you turn it on, and as the drone comes to life, its various lights flashing, the propellers automatically turn on and gives the drone lift. And at that point, you've instantaneously become a pilot in navigable airspace. And probably during the 5 or 10-minute flight, before you crash it or you get bored with it, you probably never stop to consider what the laws are surrounding drones. If you could fly where you're flying outside your house, if you violated any laws doing so, and if you possibly violated any privacy issues. And with that in mind, it is no surprise that the issue of drones and drone laws has become more of a mainstream issue, especially with the advancement in drone technology, making drones more affordable, accessible, smaller, faster, and with much more powerful cameras. In the last year alone, in 2020, we have seen there are almost 500,000 commercial drones registered with the FAA and over 1.2 million recreational drones registered last year as of this date. I imagine if you were to check back, those numbers would be much higher. So now we have to understand who is a pilot. And as both Gary and Catherine alluded to, we kind of have a few different rules for how you intend to use the drone. We have our hobbyist, who is just like our person in the scenario. They are just wanting to fly the drone because they want to fly the drone. Whereas we have the commercial remote pilot in command, or the PIC. This person requires a Part 107 commercial drone operator's license. I have mine right here. Backing up first, though, one of the major things that we see with trying to make sure liability to the pilot is reduced is to register your drone. It's an easy thing that you can do. It takes literally 5 minutes, and it's a $5 registration fee that you have to pay every 3 years, but it's very painless. The second thing, once you have your drone registered, you will probably want to decide how do you want to utilize the drone. If it's for a commercial purpose or you're utilizing it to profit in any way, you're going to need to sit for the Part 107. As Gary was explaining, it can be done relatively effortlessly by taking a test at the airport, where you can obtain a regular pilot's license. So with those two things in mind, let's go to the second part of the liability issues. We have a complex airspace that the FAA governs. And to make matters more complicated, we have multiple state and municipality laws that are also trying to govern drones, all with the goal to protect the national airspace and to protect the safety of others. However, we're seeing a bunch of clash between municipalities and state and federal law, which I'll get to in a second. One of the things that we are thinking about in the scenario that I proposed is the idea of, could we fly there? There are several types of airspace that that pilots have to be conscious of. Class G airspace, which is the which anyone can fly in, it's considered unregulated. Then we have Class B, Class C, and Class D and Class E airspace as well, which depend on what type of air traffic we see in that area. There's also temporary flight restrictions that can be imposed for things like the Super Bowl or for VIP movements. One thing that helps ease the confusion of knowing where and when you can fly is exactly what Gary posted in the chat, which is remote IDs, which are becoming more popular, and the implication of the low-level altitude authorization and notification capability, or LAANC for short, which is aiding in helping the pilots get authorization to fly missions at certain altitudes in more busy and high traffic areas. Now, the one thing that, when looking at pilot liability, it's trying to understand the laws that are surrounding a industry that is trying to find itself, trying to find what really the law should be and who should be implementing them. And one thing that I hear from multiple pilots, including myself, is just clear and concise regulations. When can I fly? How can I fly? when can't I fly? And however, we're not really getting that because, quite honestly, the FAA doesn't know, for example, what constitutes a trespass or if drones can trespass in the air. The FAA really has refused to answer that question when it comes to civil liability. However, we know of a few different torts that can be applied to taking photographic images. But then we see municipalities creating ordinances that are prohibiting when and how pilots, both hobbyists and Part 107 pilots, can operate their drones. Perfect example, pretty famous case, it's the city of Newton, where we see the city requires that you register the drone with the city, in addition to the FAA, and the courts ruled that that is in clear violation of the FAA's laws and governance. In a more bigger part of that case, we see the courts telling us that the FAA has the exclusive means for controlling UAS operations navigable airspace, which works perfectly with our understanding of federal preemption. However, there's some evolving cases with local municipalities right here in Michigan that are definitely alluding to the battle for who can control drones and the proliferation of these types of cases. One of these cases in particular actually just got resolved last year in Genesee County. Judge Farrow heard the case. It was the Michigan Coalition of Drone Operators versus Genesee County, where Genesee County had prohibited the flying of any type of drone in their county parks, full stop. Michigan has a law in the books that basically, for all intents and purposes, reads that municipalities shall not pass any laws that contradict what the federal government says when it comes to the operation of drones. And sure enough, the court rules that the ordinance is in violation of state and federal law. Currently, we see the same exact battle going on in Ottawa County, where Ottawa County has recently passed a similar law stating that the operation of drones, or prohibiting the operation of drones in Ottawa County, which the Michigan Coalition of Drone Operators has filed suit, and we will be seeing that legal battle play out. But I suspect that we will see a similar outcome going forward. So I guess to bring full circle what all this has to do with pilot liability is there's to be a drone pilot, especially a Part 107 remote pilot in command, there's more at risk than just, understanding how to run a business or understanding, how to take a good photo. It's understanding and figuring out where to find this information. But it's understanding where you can fly, when you can fly, and how you can fly. Can you fly at night? Can you fly during the day? And one of the things that is making it easier is courses like these, trying to understand where, not only how we got here, but how we got to these laws, but where these laws are going. And that is absolutely crucial. So in conclusion, I think we're going to see in the future, it will get more confusing to understand the laws that surround drones before we start to see a consensus across the board and clear and concise standards for liability that or how to reduce liability when it comes to drone pilots. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Conklin, for speaking today and your insight on drone pilot legal concerns. Again, we will take questions at the end. We're starting to get some questions in the chat. If anyone on the call has questions, please put your questions in the chat and we will address the questions after our final speaker. We have Professor Colin Mcguire next as a panelist and our final speaker talking about the Counter Drone Act. Professor Mcguire earned his Juris Doctor from WMU Cooley Law School in 2013. He is currently an adjunct professor with the law school in the Homeland and National Security LLM law program, teaching online courses entitled Small Drone Law in the Homeland Security Context and the Fourth Amendment in the Homeland Security context. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mcguire.
Thank you, Katie. I'm here today to give you all 5 facts about what I am going to title the CUAS or the Counter UAS Act. First and foremost, I want to thank Mr. Watson, Ms. Radigan, Mr. Conklin, or Rick, for their preceding contributions. You know, when Dean McDaniel and I were sort of brainstorming on this and running this through Professor Slinney, you know, we could not have imagined such high-level and knowledgeable panel members would agree to donate their time to this endeavor, and we really appreciate that. It's also a tremendous source of pride for me personally that a current student, Katie Komorowski, is organizing and moderating, and that a prior student, Rick Conklin, is a contributor. And I would mention this too, the case Rick was talking about, Michigan Coalition of Drone Operators versus Genesee County is now required reading in the drone class. And it's worth noting, I don't know if he still is, but at the time, Judge Farah was an adjunct professor at Cooley. And so that's kind of an interesting tie-in. At the time that I was at Cooley anyway, which eons ago. Nonetheless, I encourage people to view, and it's been included in the chat, Fordham Technologies video webinar series, particularly counting drones used by criminal, terrorists, and bad state actors. We provide a link to that. It's a great presentation in long form that I would recommend. Additionally, I strongly encourage you to read Ms. Radigan's law blog. It's a great law blog, talks about data privacy and drone issues and the intersection of the two, as she discussed. I'm certainly a reader. I also want to thank President of WMU Cooley, James McGrath, for his hard work here and his personal words of encouragement when we, long ago, it seems like, when we rolled out the drone law course. And also, I just want to point out, I think this is great that we're having this presentation, and that really the Homeland and National Security Law program here at WMU Cooley is taking the lead in terms of academic looks at emerging drone law issues in the United States. I think that's very cool. And today's symposium, subsequent symposium edition of the Homeland National Security Law Review, which you will see at some point here, they stand as proof of practical legal education on a critical legal issue. And I imagine the school's late founder, the late Justice Thomas C. Brennan, is proud of that. The discussion today will cover 5 facts, relatively brief, on an important yet broad statute regarding the United States government's ability to disrupt or remove unmanned aircraft systems, UAS, or unmanned aircraft, often referred to as drones, UAVs, UAs, what have you, but to remove them from the sky. The act of countering UAS is often referred to as CUAS. So that's when you hear CUAS, that's what I'm talking about. As you've heard today, there are real concerns regarding UAS, especially from so-called small drones. Yet, as we've also heard, most UAS operations are legitimate. So Congress has attempted to create a legal framework for addressing the SUAS operations of bad actors through what I call the CUAS Act. Without further ado, here are 5 takeaways from this legislation that became law on October 5th of 2018. Remember that date near the end. So the first thing to know, number 1, is that the name of the CUAS Act is not the CUAS Act. It's actually the Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018. The name CUAS Act is a nickname I use to identify the point of the statute. And the main citation, there's some others we're going to talk about, but this will be the most generally applicable statute, statutory change and addition, which is 6 USC section 124N, attached N in 2018. So 6 USC section 124N attached, making it an amendment to the Homeland Security Act. So far, this is the only version of the statute, but that figures to change based upon a reason we're going to touch on later. The need for this type of legislation became clear based upon a number of incidents involving SUAS threats and lack of countermeasures. And one of the links you'll see in the chat is to an op-ed from July 4th of 2018, published in the Washington Post by then DHS Secretary, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen M. Nielsen. It's titled, "The U.S. Isn't Prepared for the Growing Threat of Drones." Now, again, we have the link to that. It's an impassioned plea to move along this legislation, which was, I don't want to say toiling in Congress, but it was in Congress for a time. 30 days later, I believe to the day, there was an assassination attempt in Caracas, Venezuela, against President Nicolas Maduro. 2 DJI commercially available drones were strapped with explosives. And it was a failed assassination attempt, but there are actually a number of injuries resulting from the panic in the crowd below. It was a military muster that was going on, a sort of military parade. And, you know, Nicolas Maduro may be Nicolas Maduro, but Nicolas Maduro is still a politician. The legislation passed soon thereafter. So the second point is that the CUAS Act allows the government to disrupt, seize, or destroy drones. And this is the point of the legislation. The point of the statute is to allow the government to engage in CUAS activities. And in addition to tracking UAS and warning UAS operators, the statute explicitly authorizes the following. Such things: disrupting control of the UA or UAS without prior consent, and interfering with the UAS via wire, oral, electric, or radio communications used to control the UAS. It authorizes the seizure or control of unmanned aircraft systems or UAS. It authorizes the confiscation of such UAS. And it authorizes, and this is important, the use of reasonable force, if necessary, to disable, damage, or destroy UAS. Very important if you want to look at the citation on that, that's 6 USC 124N, really section B1 generally. The third point I want to make about the CUAS Act is that the CUAS Act requires carve-outs from aircraft piracy laws and frequency disruption prohibitions. And Gary touched on this a bit. At the start of the CUAS, the very first section, you'll see the government exempts itself from several laws that that would anticipate a violation, if you will, if CUAS measures were used. And that includes, as Gary previously discussed, 18 USC section 32, destruction of aircraft or aircraft facilities. Also, I think was referenced in there 49 USC 46502, aircraft piracy. But this is not an exhaustive list, but a pretty interesting one that there's a carve out from, I thought, was 18 USC 1367, which is interference with operations of a satellite. So these are the types of CUAS measures that even initially are contemplated to touch on those particular legal issues as a practical matter. And the statute significantly touches upon aviation communication concerns throughout, including requiring consultation from the 2 actors involved. And we'll talk about who that is in a sec, requiring consultation with the Federal Aviation Administration as to these CUAS measures and how they might impact even traditional aircraft. The fourth point, and this is important about this specific subsection, so we're kind of looking at the domestic context, not so much the military context where there's going to be other statutory authorities, but the fourth point is only under this section, only the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Department of Justice are authorized to use authority given under the CUAS Act. So it references specifically the Secretary of DHS and the head of DOJ, who's the Attorney General, and empowers them to make their personnel actions, to give their personnel power under the CUAS Act. So it's really just them. These personnel may conduct risk-based assessments in identifying a covered facility or asset under the CUAS Act The COAS Act does not provide separate authority to state, local, or territorial tribal law enforcement throughout, though coordination is certainly contemplated. And then you can talk about that. The fifth is that a covered asset or facility is really the key term to the CUAS Act. So you're going to see this term in there, and there's a big chunk of it at 6 USC 124N K3 that covers a covered asset or facility. And that covered asset or facility is the thing the government may use CUAS measures to protect. The definition explicitly states certain facilities or assets do fall under this category, such as federal courts, the Federal Bureau of Prison Facilities, U.S. Secret Service protective operations, and, quote, the security or protection function of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Otherwise, the CUAS Act provides factors that DHS and DOJ should use in self-identifying what a covered facility or asset is. The general idea is that DHS and DOJ will promulgate their own guidance on where CUAS measures are appropriate. However, it's important, Congress has also stated that the authority under the CUAS Act with respect to a covered facility or asset as specified in that section K3 shall terminate on the date that is 4 years after October 5th, 2018. And therefore, the CUAS Act may see significant modification, especially as to the definition of a covered facility or asset at some time in the year 2022, unless that gets extended under special provision by Congress. If you want to learn more about this subject, please take my class, SUAS in the Homeland Security Law Context through WMU Cooley's Homeland National Security Law Program. Short of that, I'd encourage you to read my current article, which is out with the Homeland and National Security Law Review. The Drones Are Coming, a legal primer for SUAS civil and criminal jurisdiction. That's 7 Homeland and National Security Law Review 64, 2021. And plus, one of the things that will come out of today will be a recording of today's discussions, and that'll be memorialized in writing, as well as additional articles, as I understand it, as part of a drone law symposium edition, featuring, again, the content of this symposium, plus articles from myself, such as, and others. And one of those is going to be discussing, and I put a little card up here earlier from the FAA, what authority local, federal, state, and local law enforcement officers who are not specifically a small cadre of FAA law enforcement officers have in dealing with seizure authorities under what we call traditional ramp check, administrative check authority. So that's an article that's going to be coming out. I'm certainly excited about that one. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Katie.
Thank you so much, Professor Mcguire, for talking about the Counter Drone Act. And thank you to all of our panelists today. So far, we are going to take questions at this time. I had prepared a few questions, but I see we have some questions in the chat here as well. Just to get us started off, the most recent one I see here is for Professor Mcguire. From a cyber context, information sharing is a big emphasis here on improving the public and private sector. Do you see similar opportunities for public-private partnership in the counter-drone landscape, or are the authorities too limited?
No, I see, in terms of just straight information sharing, I see a lot of potential opportunities. The one thing to remember, and this is frankly a point of some tension with folks like DJI, that's the largest drone manufacturer in the world, is, they collect a ton of third-party information that they hold, okay, from like all the information. And so when you get a drone, you don't just get a drone, you get the software package, you get the program, you get the platform with DJI, you get the whole thing. So I can just tell you for a fact that there are administrative warrants out there that go to DJI that use the third-party exception, okay? So there is definitely a platform for that to happen and for that information to be shared. Now, I mean, Gary could talk about this, Catherine could talk about, a lot of people could talk about the federal government and DJI and what tension there may be right now based upon national security concerns, because DJI is a Chinese-held company, okay? But there definitely is that platform for sharing in terms of public-private partnership. And also, one of the reasons that we have this authority, and again, I encourage you to look at that card I put up there from the FAA and read the later article. The FAA has very few actual law enforcement officers on the payroll, if you will, and they're sort of regionally spread out. They look to federal, state, and local, plus members of the public, really as a force multiplier. for finding violations. So people that are bad actors with COAS are doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So I see a lot of potential for public-private partnership. If you look it up on the website, there's a lot of ways you can. There's a very easy way to submit information or reports about bad actors to the FAA. People are doing not what they're supposed to be doing. And also, it should be noted that the FAA keeps both broad and thorough databases on all all SUAS that are registered. And so if you do find one, you can check on the FAA's website to see if that person is properly registered by state, by organization. So they do have that information available. And I think there's a lot of potential out there for crossover. And we don't even have time today to touch on remote ID tracking and what that's going to do for that conversation. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you. There was a question on remote ID. If we can summarize it in a short period, what are some legal issues that remote ID might raise?
So I'll float a couple, and then the real lawyers can take over. So first of all, remote ID is going to have every drone starting a year from now. Well, that's every new drone starting from a year from now. Every drone starting 2 years from now is going to be broadcasting its serial number, its location, and importantly, the GPS location of the person operating it at that moment. So, and you can just run an app on your Android phone, and maybe Apple too, that intercepts that information. So anyone who cares to know who's running that drone up there can get that information off of an app. Now, since I mentioned earlier, everyone seems to misunderstand what the laws are about drones. You're going to have a lot of confrontations, I think. And an interesting legal question is if I come up and punch somebody in the mouth who's operating a drone, do I become the remote pilot in command because I've interfered with his operation? Have I created a whole bunch of felonies for myself for doing that? And the other flip side of drone ID, and it comes back to this, the FAA wants people to report bad actors and so forth. Drone reports from humans are notoriously unreliable. There are thousands of completely ridiculous drone reports every year that are physically impossible. I've looked through a bunch of them that cannot possibly be drones, but nonetheless, they're reported because humans are not very good at picking a drone out of the sky. So you need some kind of technical intelligence. Drone ID is going to help with that, but also we sell radars and stuff for that purpose as well. So you can actually have some technical intelligence to prove that this thing really did happen. So, and then I'd like to hear what the actual lawyers think about that.
Can I say that the geolocation is personal information, so that kind of opens up what I was talking about, where that's where we see some of the laws that are protective of data. Especially, I mean, think of if I don't know, I can usually come up with crazy examples in this space, but they're not really that crazy. That you can usually find a news story about half of it. But a child's operating a drone. Now you have the GPS location of the drone. I mean, there's just kind of these, I think of all the worst things that can kind of happen with that. But with GPS, it's really, I mean, it's almost as personal. It's kind of on that line of biometric data, like biometric data, GPS, like it's pretty specific, like where you are. So I would be curious. I think one of the things that will come up is the security of that database, of, being able to access that information. And if it's, it's, the government that's not usually, it has been lately, but the cybersecurity piece, maybe not of that app, is going to be at the top of their list. We have like other things that we're working on, the cybersecurity infrastructure, but I think of it, that data is pretty sensitive, and like, how are people going to use it? Are you going to take matters into your own hands, like we've talked about throughout this, where you're going to go try to find that individual and tell them they're doing something wrong when they're not in actuality. So I see it's kind of a good and a bad, because it will probably alleviate some, if I can find out that it's a police drone, maybe I'm like, oh, okay, they're surveying the area and I don't care. Whereas if it's registered to, I'm going to go find my neighbor and tell them to, stop looking in my window. I think it kind of depends on how people are going to use it. So we'll definitely see more issues that are coming up on at least the data space. But
and I could just add real quick, the best estimate on like data privacy and drones and what you're talking about with other data is there's a significant thought that in the wake of Riley versus California, that with the cell phones, that drones are going to be treated like that cell phone. Here's a publicly available. I'm going to add it a DOJ white paper that talks about this issue in terms of Riley versus California and warrantless electronic searches, even at the border, which is the most, least amount of reasonable expectation of privacy in terms of the Fourth Amendment. So I think that's what the concern is. And there's a bunch of cases coming up right now through the circuits on searching electronic databases and what levels of the search, how deep can you go? What about when it goes to a third platform, not just the platform that's there, but when it links to something else? Has it gone beyond certain levels? Like what level of suspicion? You just straight up need a warrant, and does the warrant even cover it? And it's a huge issue, I can tell you, on consent, because people have very, very rudimentary understandings of how much information they're turning over when they waive their rights.
Yeah, I think there still is a lot of pushback on that. The remote ID. I mean, I know other attorneys I work with kind of didn't even like you have to register your drone. Like, oh, why do I have to get, thinking on that side of things, not the aviation safety piece, but why do I have to get that information over? And now I don't want the government to have it. And I think there's just kind of, honestly, there's a lot of legal issues in that'll kind of come up as that. But you need it. You need something, I guess, or it's at least a step in the right direction. But yeah, it'll be interesting, Colin, to see what comes from that.
I can probably also give you the drone pilots' take on what remote ID will do. And in most of the other remote picks that I've talked to, we're excited for it. I think that being able to finally have this integration into the national airspace system where we know where the drones are in relation to the bigger, more expensive, fun objects in the air I think it will do a lot in terms of relaxing the laws that are in place right now to allow the expansion of the commercial usage of drones. I think this will finally be the push needed to be able to lay the groundwork for that Amazon drone ship, that Walmart, Target, drone shopping orders at your door. I think that will help solve a lot of the issues and a lot of the concerns. Obviously, as both Catherine and Colin have both pointed out, that this will cause more issues as well as answer some other issues. And like anything, I think it's going to be a matter of figuring out these issues as they arise. But I mean, I think after we get used to the idea, it'll become just like we can share our location on Facebook, or we have those, Life 360 apps where people can look up your location, or even just triangulating your position. We see on TV shows all the time. I think once we figure out how it feels in real life, it's going to feel less foreign. I think with the safety features that are going to come along with those drones that have integrated the remote IDs is going to alleviate a lot of fears of the public. And as these issues get answered in the mainstream, I think people hopefully will start to understand the law behind the drone. And really, I think that will be the final piece right there, is to prevent confusion with clear and concise regulations.
The next question that I have here is specific to the Counter Drone Act. What threats are there for the state of Michigan, for example? We've got pipelines, Great Lakes, we've got the Sioux Locks, the Mackinac Bridge. Is there something that, like preventative measures that we could be taking, or who has the authority to act in that kind of a situation if there was an attack?
Well, there are, and Gary had cited some Department of Energy concepts as well, if you're talking about pipelines potentially, but really this federal, state, local, and tribal piece is an add-on to the CUAS Act and can be done in coordination with the Department of Homeland Security and coordination with the Department of Justice. So, they can sort of piggybacked on that. And I think that's where we're headed. And infrastructure, I believe, is referenced in the act. But I think that's one of those situations where we see right now DOJ has published guidance already on like a memo, a policy on how they intend to define covered facilities and assets. DHS does not, but they do have a joint legal paper, which Gary brought up earlier. They have a joint sort of legal position paper between the two of them in regards to that act. But DHS is not put out there, I think exactly. I think they're keeping it pretty broad, but there's a lot in there. So infrastructure is in there. I sense that it'll be part of whatever happens in 2022 in terms of the amendment. Because what's really interesting about the act in my assessment of the COAS Act is that usually when you leave it to the agencies, even in consultation with another agency, that's usually a direction to go promulgate regulations under the Administrative Procedures Act. And that's not what's happened in this case. They have just basically said, you can kind of write the rules on this and come back to us in 2022. So there's a lot of leeway, provided it's done in consultation with the FAA, to identify what is a covered facility or asset, and then who would have authority to do that. And it's possible expansion of authority, maybe something that proves necessary.
So once the government takes control of your drone, or once someone else tries to hack into your drone and they take control of your drone, who is liable for whatever happens, what the drone does at that point?
What do you think, Gary?
Well, my assessment is if you take over a drone, it's yours, and anything it does from that point, reasonably, you could be expected to be liable for it. The exception would be if it's got a bomb on it and you take it over and it still blows up. Maybe you're not really liable for that. But if you walk up on somebody who's flying his drone and you smack him in the head, or you handcuff him and you take over his controller, in a normal circumstance, that's your drone now, and you better be flying it legally. Is it legal airspace? Are you flying that drone in airspace you're not permitted to? Are you a licensed pilot? Is it the right time of day or night to be flying that? So in other words, are you now complying with all of the laws involved? And I think we're going to have with the drone ID thing, because it's broadcasting in the clear to anyone who's interested. You may have people trying to interfere with drone operations. I mean, just to give you an example, I don't know if you'll be able to see this really well. You can go on a website and buy these shotgun shells that are designed for shooting down drones. There really aren't anybody in the United States who's allowed to do that. But yet here they are, and they're like $20. You can buy a pack of them. So clearly there is a sort of a seething resentment of drones flying around. And like we've been talking about, I think if the drone people are more transparent with what we're doing and make people understand that, what our rights and responsibilities are as drone operators, that they will, people will calm down a bit if they know that they can have a sensible response if the drone is doing something it's not supposed to do. And that drone ID may help with that you could, if the drone's flying in your backyard, you could find out whose it is and report them to the appropriate authorities for action, assuming the authorities will actually act.
Just to be clear on that remote ID, there's going to be transponders on the drone that is going to give off a signature similar to a traditional aircraft, and then that's going to be on a system that at least the FAA and possibly others can see. So yeah, you'll be able to find out. I'll say 2 words on liability, because as Gary said, his client is generally the government. I have my background, sovereign immunity. So just never forget those 2 words in the context of liability. It really does depend who the actor is. But I do think you're going to see a point where even a local law enforcement officer is going to be able to, either through something like a radar gun or by checking an online system, is going to be able to identify who's operating in that area or who should be. And if they're not sending out a frequency, that's going to be bad news, or as we say down in the valley, no bueno.
So will people then that currently have drones need to add and upgrade their drone to be in compliance with this new law?
Yeah, the rule basically says at the end, there's a compliance period. It's like a year from when, so it'd be 2023, I guess, fall of 2023. You're required to have the drone ID implemented. You can add on a transponder, or you can fly in certain designated playgrounds that they'll specify that you can fly in. I will say that the add-on transponder has limitations as to what you're allowed to do with the add-on transponder. You're not as fully, it's not as permissible as it is with a built-in transponder because it has less important data. But yeah, you're going to have to comply with it. And people are mad about that because there's millions of people who have drones, and a lot of them are very expensive. But DJI, for example, the drones they're making today with a software update will be able to do drone ID. So, it won't necessarily mean that you have to throw away your drone if you've bought it recently.
Thank you. And then I had another question that was more lighthearted. Christmas time's coming up. What happens if a child gets a drone for Christmas? Can they fly a drone? Do they need to be a pilot in command? Do their parents need to be licensed? How does that work?
I'll say this one distinction, Rick. I think you should answer this, but I want to give this one distinction that's in the regulations. And Katie and Rick, everyone knows this, but that's on the panel. There is a distinction between a small drone and like a micro drone. So if it's under 0.55 pounds, that's like what many children would have. These regulations are largely just not going to apply. Okay. So when you start to get a little bigger, so if they just have sort of a dinky copter sort of thing that's under 0.55, that just doesn't apply at all. But if you just decided you had, I don't know, like a 14, 15-year-old kid that you thought could handle a DJI Phantom or something, and you just want to drop the money on that instead of a pony or whatever. That's part of the issue is that it's not that expensive. It's part of the issue that we see with the counter drone piece. But yeah, then it'd be a different discussion. Rick, if you want to take that one.
Can I also say, is this right? And if it's not being flown for commercial purpose, then it's sort of a different, right? Like that 16 years old for a commercial pilot, right? And then there's still registration requirements and all that, but if it's a hobbyist, there's different regulations. And I think I agree, Colin, that most of them are going to be tiny things that don't weigh anything anyway, so it wouldn't apply, but I'll let Rick.
So yeah, both are correct. The rule is if it's under half a pound, you don't have to register it. If it's 0.55 or above, it's a $5 registration fee. Go on the FAA website. I think it's Drone Zone, and they'll have to register it. A lot of times, if the person is over 13, it's over 16 to be to get a license to fly a remote pilot license. However, hobbyists have different regulations they have to follow. But yeah, if it's under that, then they won't have to register it. I'm not sure what that will look like once the remote ID comes out. However, the one key part that the FAA makes a very clear distinction on is, let's say you gift your drone that you have to another person. Let's say I'm done with my DJI Phantom and I want to give it to a friend of mine. They will have to go register the drone as well. That registration doesn't transfer, much like a car title. They'll have to go register that with the DMV. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Thank you. I have another question in the chat. Will law enforcement be exempt from any of the transponder regs?
So real quick on that, the reg is going to apply through the manufacturer. So the answer to that would likely be no. That they will still have to, and they're still required. There's some differences in registration and ease of permitting under certificates of authorization for law enforcement, but they still, this was part of the big change in 2016 with Part 107, is there was a rule for public and a rule for private, and now there's really just one rule that's a little easier for both in terms of, it's a little easier for public, or the private, excuse me, after the government. It's a little easier for the government, but it's supposed to be easier for everyone. So.
I thought Katie was going to ask about the holiday shopping season to see if, if we could just let drones do deliveries, we wouldn't have these shipping issues. It would be much faster. It'd be landing on our doorsteps overnight. So
that's also a good point.
Amazon drone swarms. There we go.
I will just comment a couple other quick things. We are actually talking to all the federal agencies and involved with various kinds of tests. So they're all involved in doing all kinds of counter UAS testing and evaluation. And we go out and do events with them and stuff like that. And so they're all very, very involved, but I think they're pretty far from deciding what the official policy is going to be as far as counter UAS is concerned, except for the DoD. And they've got their own complexities, but that's we're involved a lot with that, but we're also involved with the BVLOS people, the beyond visual line of sight, because we sell, I actually have one sitting here, this little radar, which is meant to go on a drone for detecting other traffic. There's tons of activity with human flight and package flight as well. Again, waiting on rulemaking from the FAA to actually make it a reality, which is years and years away, we think.
I just want to make this point. Gary made a great point on testing with CUAS. Part of, if you read then Secretary Nielsen's op-ed, part of her argument was the laws were so archaic, I guess you'd say, on drones, that DHS was not able to appropriately test CUAS measures without breaking all these laws. So, I mean, you just had to have the law passed just to start really testing things in 2018 legally. And then, hopefully we have some results by 2022. And you'll see that consistently throughout different SUAS laws that Congress has passed, is the testing piece is required and authorized for various types of activities. We're really still at that stage, and that's why I think it's such an exciting and growing area of the law.
And we're talking just about the USA here. We're an international company, so we're dealing with this times 100 because we're dealing with every other country as well. And every country has everything is different in every country.
I would like to thank all the panelists again for speaking today, and everyone for joining this event, and for the law school for assisting me in organizing this event. This will be posted online, and we will be drafting a special edition of the WMU Cooley Homeland and National Security Law Review about this event. So please look for that information.